Shalom, everyone. This is Rabbi Allen. And so, as we've been doing every week, we are going to connect the Tanakh, especially the Torah, with Yeshua. So this week, we're doing the portion from Numbers. It's a double portion, Chukat and Balak. And Chukat in English is regulation or ordinance. Balak is the name of the person, Balak, but actually his name means destroyer. And so once again, it's from Numbers 19:1 through 25:9. And let's get right into it today and see how we are going to be connecting the Torah portion with Yeshua, because as I remind you every week, Yeshua, at one point he spoke to his disciples and he showed them how all of the Torah and the Tanakh spoke of him. And so we need to realize that God has told his Jewish people through the ages about Messiah. He tells us about who he was, who he is, where he'll come from, how he'll be born, what he'll do during his life. And as we'll see today, it will talk about a very important portion of his ministry. And so let's get right into it. So chapter 20 of our double portion, we see that the children of Israel start complaining and grumbling once again. And this time they're complaining that they have no water to drink. And so it says they are gathered against Moses and Aaron. And they complain to them that there's no water and we're going to die of thirst in the wilderness, and it would be better if we were back in Egypt. And so Moses and Aaron go before Adonai. They go before the Lord, and they ask the Lord what to do because the people are complaining and grumbling. And so this is what God basically says to them. He says, take the rod, your rod. And this is the rod, of course, that they used for many miracles when they were crossing the Red Sea and when they were in the wilderness. God said, take the rod. And he says to Moses, I want you to speak to the rock. He doesn't say speak to a rock. He says speak to the rock. And he's alluding to the rock that was in the wilderness, the same rock that God initially told Moses to strike the rock so that the rock would bring forth water for the children of Israel to drink. And so we'll talk about how it can be the same rock in just a minute. But what happened was Moses and Aaron go before the rock, and instead of speaking to the rock, as God instructed to Moses to do, he takes the rod and he strikes the rod 2 times, and water gushes through, comes out of the rock. And it says that not only was there enough water to quench the thirst of all of the congregation of Israel, probably at least 3 million people, but it says that it also gave enough water so that the livestock could drink. So we know it was well over 6 million mouths that drank that water. This is the supernatural event that took place because God allowed the rock to bring forth water. Now, because Moses disobeyed God, he didn't speak to the rock. He struck the rock with the rod the way he struck the rock the first time. God says to Moses, "You will not bring the children of Israel into the land." Joshua's going to do that, but you will not bring the children of Israel into the land. And what happens is Moses is going to die before the children of Israel are preparing to enter the land. And that's the punishment to Moses because he doesn't obey God and he strikes the rock instead of speaking to the rock. Now, two things we understand that this was a reality in the wilderness, and I want to read from Psalm 78. It was a psalm of Asaph. It wasn't one of the psalms of King David, but it was a psalm of Asaph. Asaph was the head singer that was appointed by David to sing in the temple. He was a Levite. He was from the tribe of Levi. And so in his Psalm 78, in verse 15 and 16, he said, and he, Moses, split the rock in the wilderness and gave them drink in abundance. And then he said, he also brought forth streams out of the rock and caused water to run like rivers. In verse 20, once again, he speaks or sings about the rock in the wilderness, and he says, behold, he struck the rock, so waters gushed out. And so this was a reality, and the children of Israel knew about this rock in the wilderness. I'm going to jump ahead just a little bit, and I want to say something. The rock in the wilderness not only speaks of Messiah Yeshua, but it was Messiah Yeshua in the wilderness, following them in the wilderness. Remember, it was the rock that God had Moses to speak to. It was the rock. It was the same rock that was in the wilderness a little bit before that brought forth water. But we know from Rav Shaul, the Apostle Paul, we know that that rock was in fact Messiah. And so we read in 1 Corinthians, in the letter to the Corinthians, Shaul wrote in Corinthians 10:4, he said, and they drank from the spiritual rock that accompanied them through the wilderness, and that rock was Messiah. And so as I spoke to earlier in our videos, not only was it the pillar of fire and cloud that followed them in the wilderness, and that fire and cloud, in fact, was Messiah Yeshua, but the rock followed them in the wilderness, and that rock was Messiah Yeshua. And so realizing and understanding that rock was Messiah Yeshua, this is how we see a little bit more of Messiah Yeshua's life and his ministry to his Jewish people and also to the entire world. There's a big misunderstanding in the traditional Jewish community. It's been going on for quite a while. The main reason that the traditional rabbis today say that that Yeshua could not be the Messiah, it seems to be it's almost as if it's the only reason that they can give why he isn't the Messiah of the Jewish people. And maybe it's just smoke and mirrors that they use. Maybe they know, in fact, it's not really true, what they're saying. But this is what they say. They say, well, Yeshua can't be the Messiah because the Messiah was to come and bring peace to the people and to set them free from the Romans. Now, if we are to understand that Yeshua came 2 times according to the prophet Isaiah and according to some of the other prophets, that there was this sort of twofold ministry of Messiah Yeshua, that he came one time 2,000 years ago, and he will be returning in the future. We see that he did come to bring peace, but he didn't come to bring peace to the world. He didn't come to bring peace in a sense that we were to be freed from the Roman rule, but he came to bring peace to our hearts on a one-to-one basis, on an individual basis. He came to free us from the slavery and bondage of sin. And when he returns, he will return as a ruling and reigning king, and then he will set the world free from the bondage of the world and the bondage of the slavery and bondage of sin for good. And so here is how we see the connection. The first time Moses was to strike the rock and the water would come forth. But the second time, God didn't want him to strike the rock. He wanted him to speak the rock. Just as the Messiah came the first time and he was struck down. He was crucified. But we know when he comes again, he will not be struck down. He will not be crucified. He will rule and reign forever. And so God had Moses in the, if we can say, the second coming of the rock, the second incidence with the rock, that Moses, you are not to strike the rock again, as the Messiah would not be struck when he returns, but you are to speak to the rock. And so the return of Yeshua is a reality. And so the traditional rabbis, they've got it wrong. If that's their only reason that they say that Yeshua isn't the Messiah, or the main reason, they're wrong. That even the prophets speak of a twofold ministry of Messiah, that he would come one time to suffer, to be a servant for the people, and to die, and then he would return and be the ruling and reigning king, never to be struck again. So that's it for our Torah portion and Yeshua in the Torah portion this week. If you're watching us on YouTube, share it with friends. Subscribe to our channel. The channel is Rabbi on the Fly. And until then, we will see you next week. This is Rabbi Allen saying, Shalom, Shalom.